The Brinks-Matte Robbery, secrets behind the greatest gold heist ever. Imagine London in the 1980s, where the air is heavy with promises and disillusionment. It was a time when contrasts were drawn with almost painful clarity. On one side, the elegant skyscrapers of the city, housing immense wealth. On the other, working-class neighborhoods where hope was a daily struggle to maintain. It was in this contrasting world that our protagonists grew up. Brian Robinson, the mastermind behind the heist, hadn't always been a calculating man. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood, surrounded by the clamor of factories and the exhausted breaths of his parents after long days of work. As a child, he dreamed of greatness, but life seemed to offer only insurmountable walls. At school, he was brilliant yet unruly, often punished for challenging authority. His mother would often tell him, "Brian, you're meant for great things, but you need to learn to channel your energy." These words would resonate with him for years. In his teenage years, he met Michael McAvoy. Michael, his complete opposite, was massive, calm, and possessed a raw strength that commanded respect. They met in an alley after a fight where Michael had, without meaning to, injured another boy. Impressed by his strength, Brian extended his hand. "We could help each other, you and me," he said with a sly smile. Michael, initially wary, eventually accepted. It was the beginning of an unbreakable friendship, cemented by petty thefts and schemes in their neighborhood. But the story doesn't stop there. Over the years, their duo expanded. They met Tony White, a clever mechanic capable of disarming an alarm with rudimentary tools. Then came John Davis, a discreet yet formidable man known for his precision. Finally, Kenneth Noye, the master of money laundering, joined their circle, bringing with him a unique expertise. Together, they formed a formidable group, each member having a precise and complementary role. It was in a smoky pub in East London that the idea for the heist took shape. Anthony Black, a guard working at the Brinks-Matte warehouse, spoke too much after a few pints of beer. "You'd never guess what they keep in there," he murmured to Brian. Brian, always on the lookout for opportunities, raised an eyebrow. "Go on," he said calmly, his eyes fixed intently on Anthony. Anthony described the warehouse, its thick walls, armored doors, and most importantly, the treasure it held. Gold bars, stacks of cash, jewelry, unimaginable riches. "And the security?" Michael asked, crossing his arms. Anthony smiled nervously. "I am the security," he replied. "I know every inch of that building." For weeks, the group met in an abandoned factory to perfect their plan. A large wooden table was covered in sketches, photos, and hastily written notes. Every detail was analyzed, every step carefully planned. "We have to be quick," Brian said, pointing at a blueprint of the warehouse. "Once we're inside, we have less than 20 minutes before anyone notices something's wrong." Tony, seated across from him, nodded. "I can disable the alarms, but not for long. Once they're off, We need to move like a well-oiled machine. The discussions became more intense. Michael, ever the pragmatist, asked the question that haunted the group. And what if it goes wrong? What if someone resists? Brian was silent for a moment before replying. No one gets hurt. That's our rule. We go in, take what we want, and disappear. November 26, 1983. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The group gathered in a dark alley near the warehouse. Each man wore dark, inconspicuous clothing and gloves to avoid leaving traces. The icy wind whistled through the buildings, and the night seemed to hold its breath. "This is it," murmured Brian, looking each of his men in the eye. "You know what to do. No mistakes. In and out. Simple as that." Inside the warehouse, Anthony Black watched the clock nervously. Each second felt like an eternity. He heard a faint creak as the outer door opened, signaling the group's arrival. His heart raced, but he kept his composure. He gave a quick signal, then returned to his post as if nothing was amiss. Brian and Michael entered first, their steps muffled on the concrete floor. Tony swiftly disabled the alarms, his nimble fingers working with impressive precision. "We're good," he whispered, "but we have to move fast." In the main hall, the warehouse employees were caught in their morning routine. "Stay calm," Brian said, his voice low but firm. "No tricks, and no one gets hurt." The employees were led into a side room, their faces betraying fear but also a sense of resignation. In the main hall of the warehouse, the thieves' footsteps echoed faintly, like a subdued rhythm in the vast space. Brian led the way, his eyes scanning every detail, calculating distances and potential risks. Behind him, Michael followed, his broad shoulders almost filling the narrow spaces. Tony focused intently, opening a small toolbox with swift, precise movements. "Give me a minute," he murmured, crouching by the alarm control panel. His deft fingers worked through the colored wires one by one, like a musician playing a silent melody. From his station, Anthony observed everything with a mix of anxiety and resignation. He cast furtive glances at the cameras, ensuring that all was proceeding according to plan. Every move the thieves made seemed part of a meticulously rehearsed choreography. Outside, the wind grew stronger, whistling through the cracks in the walls, adding an almost otherworldly tension to the scene. In the neighboring room, the employees, gathered and silent, remained motionless. They exchanged glances, but no one dared to speak. The tension was palpable, yet Brian's calm voice still resonated in their minds. "Stay quiet. You'll be home in an hour." Tony finally finished disabling the alarms and stood up, wiping a drop of sweat from his brow despite the cold air. "All clear," he whispered. "The way is open." Brian nodded. "Michael, with me. John, stay here and keep watch." They moved toward the vault, where the massive armored door stood like a silent sentinel. Michael retrieved a heavy metallic tool from his bag, positioning it carefully against the door hinges. He struck gently, adjusting the angle before unleashing a series of powerful motions. The door gave way with a dull thud, a thin cloud of dust rising into the air, illuminated by the dim neon lights. When the door swung open, a golden glow filled the room. Gold bars were stacked in impeccable columns, reflecting every light beam in a dazzling display. The silence broke with a collective gasp of awe. Even Brian, always in control, froze momentarily. "By all the gods," Michael muttered, unable to look away. Tony, who had joined them, let out a low whistle of admiration. "I've never seen anything like this, not even in my dreams." Brian quickly regained his composure. "We'll admire it later," he said firmly but softly. "Michael, take that side. Tony, with me. Start loading." The bars, though appearing small, each weighed nearly 12 kilograms. Lifting them was a brutal reminder of their immense value. Michael, with his natural strength, carried 2 at a time to the truck, though even he began to tire. "Damn, it's not just gold, it's punishment," he joked, panting heavily. Tony, meanwhile, carefully arranged the bars in the truck, optimizing every inch of space. "We could almost open a bank with this," he murmured nervously. Brian stayed focused, checking his watch and scanning the surroundings. "Faster," he said, glancing back. "We've passed 10 minutes. No room for mistakes." Despite the urgency, every move was deliberate, almost choreographed. Inside, Anthony kept watching the cameras. His nerves frayed as the seconds ticked by, but he whispered to himself, "Stay calm. It's fine. They'll be gone before anyone notices." When the last bar was loaded, the truck groaned under the weight, its suspension creaking. Tony shut the rear doors carefully, double-checking the locks. Brian gave Anthony a quick nod through the camera. "Good luck," he murmured, though the guard couldn't hear him. The truck rolled away slowly, its headlights piercing the darkness. In the cab, Brian sat next to Michael, his face composed, though his mind was racing. Behind them, the city lights faded, replaced by the shifting shadows of fields and trees. Through the open window, a cool breeze swept in, carrying the earthy scent of the countryside. The hum of the truck engine was steady, like a soothing yet ominous rhythm. "Brian," Michael murmured after a long silence, "do you think we really pulled it off? That this will work?" Brian didn't turn his head. "We don't have a choice, Michael. We're already halfway across the river. We have to swim to the other side." The truck moved slowly along winding roads, its headlights cutting through the dense darkness. The English countryside was shrouded in a thick silence, broken only by the rustling wind through the trees. Every turn of the wheels seemed to amplify the tension in the air. In the cab, Michael stared out the window, his fingers drumming nervously on the door. "Brian," he murmured, breaking the silence, "do Do you think all this will disappear like we planned? That the gold won't stick to us? Brian's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Michael, gold never truly disappears, he replied calmly. But we can, if we do everything right. Ahead, the silhouette of a farm emerged against the starry sky. The lights were off, but a faint flicker in a barn window betrayed a presence. Kenneth Noye was already at work. He had been preparing for this night for weeks, every tool carefully placed, every detail meticulously planned. The truck slowed as it approached, its tires crunching softly on the gravel. Brian turned off the engine and exhaled deeply before stepping out. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and aged wood. The silence was nearly absolute, punctuated only by the distant hoot of an owl. Kenneth Noye stepped out of the barn, his imposing figure illuminated by the flickering light of a fire inside. He wore a flannel shirt and worn trousers, but his demeanor was resolute. "You're on time," he said, approaching with a low, authoritative voice. Brian extended a hand. "There's no room for error tonight," he replied. Noye nodded, his cold gaze sweeping over the group. "Everything's ready. You've done your part, now it's my turn." The truck's rear doors creaked as they were opened, revealing the carefully stacked gold bars. Even Noye, accustomed to dealing with fortunes, was momentarily silent at the sight. "Impressive," he murmured almost to himself. "But this is still too recognizable. It all has to be transformed." Inside the barn, an industrial furnace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Tools were neatly arranged on a wooden table, their metallic surfaces gleaming faintly in the firelight. A basin filled with water sat nearby, ready to cool the molten metal. "We'll melt it all," Noye explained, gesturing to the metal molds near the furnace. "Every bar will become a fragment, untraceable and impossible to identify." Michael and Tony began unloading the bars one by one, their movements slow but steady. Each touch of the cold metal was a reminder of the incredible value of their loot. "I could carry these all night," Michael joked, wiping his forehead. "But I'd rather have a pint." Tony chuckled lightly but kept his focus on the task. "Not until we're done, big guy. And don't drop anything." Noye fired up the furnace to full power, filling the barn with a glowing red light. He grabbed a bar with a sturdy pair of tongs and placed it into the crucible, where it began to melt slowly. The crackling of the fire grew louder, a hypnotic sound that filled the space. Michael watched the process with fascination, his eyes reflecting the flickering light. "You know, it's almost beautiful," he murmured to Brian, standing beside him. "Something so hard and precious turning into liquid." Brian said nothing, his gaze fixed on the molten gold. Noye worked with precision, almost like an artist. "Fire purifies everything," he said in a measured tone. "What's left is only what we want to keep." The molten gold was poured into molds, its golden shine replaced by a fiery red glow. As the metal cooled, it was broken into fragments, ready to be transported or sold without a trace. But despite the apparent success, a silent tension began to settle over the group. Each man, though focused on his task, felt the weight of what they had done. Michael, ever pragmatic, whispered a question to Brian. "And after? When it's all sold, what do we do? Do we leave or do we stay?" Brian didn't answer immediately, letting the question linger in the heat-filled air. "We'll see," he finally said. "One step at a time." In a corner of the barn, Tony and John spoke in low voices. "Do you think we can really get away with this?" John asked, his eyes fixed on the cooling gold fragments. "If someone talks, we're finished." Tony shook his head. "No one will talk. We're all in the same boat." Overhearing their conversation, Noye looked up from his work. "If you have doubts, now's the time to leave," he said calmly. "Once this gold is sold, there's no turning back." Silence fell again, heavier than before. When the final gold bar was transformed, the group stood still for a moment, gazing at their handiwork. The fire in the furnace slowly died down, plunging the barn into a calming darkness. Noye wiped his hands on a cloth, a faint look of satisfaction crossing his face. "It's done," he said simply. "Now, it's up to you what to do with it." The truck, now emptied of its original bars, was ready to leave. Brian cast one last look at the barn before climbing into the cab. Outside, the wind whispered softly, as if it carried their thoughts. "We did it," Michael murmured, almost to himself. But lingering in the air, invisible yet present, was a doubt, a nagging feeling they couldn't shake. The truck started slowly, its tires crunching over the gravel. The night air flowed into the cab again, carrying the familiar scent of damp soil and charred wood. Beyond the truck, the countryside was cloaked in darkness, a silence broken only by the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. The stars in the clear sky cast a faint glow over the sinuous road ahead. Inside the cab, the group remained silent. Words were no longer necessary. They had done what they came to do, and yet an odd sense of unease settled over them. The weight of the gold had left their hands, but still seemed to press on their consciences. "This isn't over," Brian finally said, breaking the silence. "The hardest part is yet to come." Michael turned his head slightly, his eyes betraying a flicker of concern. "You think we'll make it?" "This isn't like the others, Brian. It's not just cash. It's 3 tons of gold." Brian kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the steering wheel steady. He didn't respond immediately, his thoughts racing as fast as the kilometers passing beneath them. The hum of the engine provided a steady rhythm, almost comforting in its predictability. Taking a deep breath, Brian let the wind brush his face and finally murmured, "We'll be fine. It's just a matter of time." The truck rolled on, but as the kilometers passed, the anxiety grew. The weight of the stolen gold lingered in the air, intangible but heavy. Behind them, in the barn, the frenzy of their transformation process had faded, leaving behind only shadows. Each twist and turn of the road seemed to bring a new wave of doubt. In the back of the truck, John couldn't help but voice his thoughts. "What if we get caught?" he muttered, his words barely audible but echoing like a warning. Tony, ever the pragmatist, shook his head. "There's no going back. What we've done can't be undone." "So, what? You're saying we live with this secret forever?" John asked, frustration flickering in his eyes. "No secret," Brian said from the front, turning briefly to meet John's gaze. "Just to deal with reality." The mood in the truck grew heavier, like an invisible shroud settling over them. Suddenly, the crackle of the police radio pierced the atmosphere. A message came through, clear and chilling. "Robbery reported at Brinks-Matte warehouse. 3 tons of gold stolen. Be on the lookout for suspicious vehicles." For a moment, the thieves' hearts seemed to stop. The radio fell silent again, leaving only the tension-filled hum of the engine. Michael's face turned pale. "This is going to be harder than we thought," he murmured. Brian didn't say anything, his eyes sharper than ever, cutting through the darkness ahead. "Focus," he said finally. "We can't afford to falter now." In the days that followed, the group's lives were marked by a palpable tension. Each man scattered to separate hideouts, attempting to stay out of sight, but the anxiety of the unknown gnawed at them. The police, well aware that the heist was the work of professionals, intensified their investigation. Metal detectors combed the countryside, roads were monitored, and questions were whispered through the underworld. Rumors swirled. The gold was already on its way to the black market, or perhaps hidden, waiting to be discreetly sold. Brian knew time was against them. "We need to get rid of the gold," he muttered, the pressure weighing on him. "Otherwise, we'll lose everything." Kenneth Noye, in particular, took charge of the situation. The group gathered at his isolated country house, far from prying eyes. The plan was simple but ruthless: melt the gold, break it into small, untraceable pieces, and ship it abroad in a form that no one could recognize. Even with the logic of the plan, the fear of capture hung over them like a dark cloud. "If someone talks," Tony began, before falling silent. "No one will talk," Brian interrupted. "And if anyone does, we'll be ready." As the days passed and the tension continued to mount, each member of the group began reflecting on what they had done. The process of transforming the gold was long and exhausting. Bars melted slowly in the furnace, their golden luster transforming into a molten red glow that flickered in the dim barn. The sound of melting metal was like a sinister melody, a constant reminder that the gold had a life of its own, existing independently of the hands that held it. Michael, who had always been a man of action and few words, found himself alone in a corner of the barn, his hands blackened with soot. He stared at the melting pieces, contemplating all that had been sacrificed. "We could have had more," he murmured, "if we had just been more patient." Brian, who had been observing him silently, finally replied, "The biggest trap, Michael, is thinking that gold will give you what you're looking for." The group began to scatter, with some shipping the transformed gold through discrete networks, while others stayed behind, waiting to see how things would unfold. Brian, as always, remained in the shadows. The silence surrounding him seemed to engulf him, but in his mind, the wheels were constantly turning. He thought back to the early days in the alleyways, to dreams of a better future, but also to the fragility of everything he had built. We've escaped, but at what cost? He wondered in the stillness of the night, alone with his thoughts. The gold, although transformed and scattered, had not truly disappeared. The ghosts of the past continued to haunt the dreams of every member of the group, an eternal reminder of what they had achieved and lost. Beyond the wealth and the fear of betrayal, there remained a deeper truth. Sometimes what we seek consumes us before we even find it. Months passed, and the story of the Brinks-Matte heist became an urban legend. Despite their efforts, the authorities never managed to recover all the gold. Some said it lay buried underground in forgotten vaults, or that it had been melted and turned into objects of no apparent value. Metal detectors continued to scrape the earth, and rumors would arise and fade. But the gold, like a mirage, remained elusive. And in the fog of time, the story lived on, whispered in the dark corners of pubs and alleys. A mystery that only the wind seemed to know, a soft breath that carried with it the secrets and shadows. The passing months found the group scattered, each hiding in a different corner of the city or countryside, far from prying eyes. The once bustling streets of London now felt foreign to Brian. He would occasionally wander through neighborhoods he once knew but felt detached from it all. The places were no longer the same. Faces blurred, conversations became unintelligible. It was as if the weight of his actions had turned him into a spectator of his own life. In a Soho cafe, he found himself staring into a grimy mirror, looking at a reflection he barely recognized. The man staring back at him was tired, marked by recent events. He had never imagined that gold could have this kind of power to haunt them so profoundly. "We have to keep going," he murmured to himself. "We planned for everything. No turning back." But deep down, uncertainty grew, just as fear did. It was an insidious poison that crept into his thoughts. Each member of the group, though scattered, shared an invisible connection of anxiety and solitude. Michael, once a man of few words, began to change. He would visit churches, light candles, and sit for hours in silence. His faith, long lost after years of delinquency, began to return like a small flame flickering in the night. "I should never have touched that gold," he murmured to himself, alone in a church. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. But then he straightened up, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "Everything has a price, and I'll pay it." Elsewhere in the city, Tony, the man who had disabled the alarms and opened the way into the warehouse, began receiving anonymous threats. Letters were left under his door, cryptic messages about the gold, the theft, and those still hunting for it. Each time he opened a new envelope, his hands shook. He knew deep down that they had left a trace, no matter how small, and that they would all pay eventually. "I can't live like this," he confided to Brian one evening, his hands trembling. "I'm tired." Brian looked at him in silence. "You have a choice," he finally said, his voice almost detached. "We all have choices, but you already know that." Meanwhile, Scotland Yard intensified its pursuit. The investigators knew the heist had been carried out by professionals. These weren't amateurs. Their meticulous planning had left little room for error. Gordon Stevenson, the lead inspector on the case, was relentless. He knew the robbery had been executed too perfectly for there not to be a mistake somewhere. He meticulously examined every clue, surveillance footage, witnesses, and every minor detail that could have been overlooked. "This isn't just a robbery," Stevenson told his colleagues during a meeting. "These guys planned every move. They know their craft, but they must have left something behind." The inspector pored over a board filled with photos and sketches of the suspects, scrutinizing each face with unwavering intensity. "One of them will crack eventually," he said. "And that's when we'll have them." Despite the tightening net around them, Brian, Michael, Tony, and the others continued living in the shadows of their crime. They moved from place to place, changing identities and hideouts, constantly watching their backs. Rumors began to spread. Metal detectors scoured fields in search of gold bars, jewelers were questioned about unusual pieces, and the black market buzzed with whispers. The pressure to unload the stolen gold mounted by the day. Brian, however, had made a decision. He knew the time had come to flee, to leave the country that knew them too well. He spent hours planning, calculating every detail. "One last move," he told himself, "and then we're gone. Far, far away." But even as he made his decision, doubt lingered. The price of freedom, which they all sought, seemed to slip further from their grasp with every step. But like all secrets and hidden weights, the gold eventually revealed itself. Tony, overwhelmed by the threats and his mounting paranoia, began to behave differently. He spoke too much, became increasingly nervous, and seemed on the verge of breaking. The others, who had once been his allies, began to see through his facade. "Are you betraying us, Tony?" Michael asked one evening as they gathered in a dingy apartment. Tony furrowed his brow, then lowered his gaze. "No. I'm just tired, that's all." Brian watched them both, his piercing gaze unwavering. "A man who draws attention to himself becomes a target," he said softly. "We are no longer people, we're shadows. And shadows must remain silent." The police continued to tighten their grip, but with each lead, the group seemed to slip further into obscurity. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The gold, melted and scattered, disappeared into the hidden corners of the world. But the weight of the crime remained. The shadow of the heist, the lives it broke, and the dreams it destroyed hung over them like an ever-present specter. Brian, sitting alone in a motel room on the outskirts of the city, thought back to the early days of the operation and the dreams of freedom they had once shared. In the stillness of the night, he wondered if what they had sought was ever truly worth what they had lost. "Gold is just a metal," he whispered to himself. "The real treasure is the one you carry within, and that's the one you can't afford to lose." The authorities' net slowly closed around the group, though no one knew exactly where they were hiding. Scattered across the dark corners of Europe, the thieves changed hideouts and identities repeatedly. But no matter how far they ran, the shadow of the heist followed them, ready to reveal itself. The memories of that night, when the gold gleamed for the last time, became ghosts that trailed them unseen but deeply felt. Brian, ever the leader, began to feel the weight of it all. The days passed in a blur, blending into an endless repetition. He woke early, stayed up late, and in every action, he questioned whether this life was truly his. The burden of the gold, though physically gone, still weighed heavily on his shoulders. He never imagined that the pursuit of wealth could create such an emptiness. Sitting in a small motel room in Brussels, alone with his thoughts, he stared out at the gray sky, heavy with clouds, and wondered where he might have ended up if he hadn't taken this path. If only, he murmured. But there was no place for regret now. All he could do was keep moving forward. The group, now scattered and hidden across Europe, began to fracture. The bonds that had once held them together through ambition and a thirst for power were breaking under the weight of their secrets and lies. Tony, in particular, became a man of shadows. His confidence eroded as he became haunted by the idea that someone might discover their whereabouts. He saw police officers everywhere, thought he heard voices in the alleys he walked. One night, during a rare meeting in an isolated house to exchange information, Tony declared, "I can't keep going like this. I can't keep looking over my shoulder at every corner." Brian, sitting quietly, stared at him for a long moment. "Then you know what you have to do," he said coldly. Tony looked at him, his eyes filled with anger and fear. "And if I want to walk away?" Brian stood slowly, his piercing blue eyes fixed on Tony. "You don't have another choice. You want to run? It's too late for that." The conversation ended there, and an almost tangible tension filled the room. Michael, who had remained silent until then, observed the scene quietly. He saw Tony curling inward under the weight of his own thoughts, but remained steadfast in his own resolve. What had once been a group united by ambition and the pursuit of power was now fragmenting under the weight of their shared guilt. Brian, Michael, and Tony spoke less and less as the days went on. The paths they had chosen grew harder to follow, and a general unease spread through the group. What had once united them, their quest for fortune, now became the source of a slow disintegration. The gold was gone, yet the fear it left behind continued to consume them. Phone calls became rare. Exchanges of money or goods were reduced to mechanical gestures, devoid of the camaraderie they had once shared. One morning, Michael awoke in a cramped apartment in Madrid, his dreams haunted by visions of gold melting in the flames. He rose and looked out the window, his reflection blurred in the glass. In his mind, the memories of the glimmering bars and the scent of molten gold followed him everywhere. The longer he dwelled on it, the more a thought haunted him. This dream of wealth had only amplified their solitude. "Why did we do all this?" he whispered to himself, his hands trembling. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heavy breathing from the other side of the room. Tony, visibly disturbed, sat slumped in a chair, unable to relax. "I can't keep going," Tony murmured, almost to himself. Michael heard him and looked over, but he didn't know how to respond. The police, meanwhile, had not relented in their pursuit. Detective Gordon Stevenson, though worn down by months of fruitless investigation, remained as determined as ever. He knew the thieves couldn't disappear forever. They had left traces, small but crucial, and one day those traces would lead back to them. He reviewed the files, piecing together clues left by the group's various members. "Every move, every mistake is an opportunity for us," he told his team, his eyes fixed on a board of evidence marked with the suspects' names. But for now, the thieves remained shadows, invisible, hidden, scattered across a vast world. As the months dragged on, the strain of it all began to show. Brian, still determined but deeply marked by the ordeal, began to confront a truth that many of his companions refused to see. He understood, at last, that what they had done, what they had lost, could never truly be repaired. The gold, as brilliant as it was, could not make up for the sacrifices they had made. He found himself alone in a hotel room in Berlin, the night falling quietly through the window. The wind stirred the curtains like a door hesitant to close. Taking out an old notebook, he opened it and began to write. "What I've lost can never be recovered," he wrote. "The gold blinded me, but it also showed me what I didn't want to see." In the years that followed, each of them tried to make sense of what had driven them to sacrifice everything. Perhaps, deep down, the gold had never been the true goal, but rather freedom, the kind that came with a price far higher than they had ever imagined. And as the noise of the outside world faded, their quest dissolved into the fog of time. The group, now scattered and living in constant fear, knew that eventually someone would talk. The weight of what they had stolen had become too much to bear. Though they had grown rich, the cost had been far greater than they could have foreseen. The shadows of their past trailed them inescapable, like echoes of their choices. As the story of the stolen gold continued to circulate, they realized, perhaps too late, that wealth had never been what they truly sought. Months after the heist, the group, though spread across Europe, sensed the end was near. Rumors intensified, and the police began to close in. Even those who had managed to vanish felt the mounting pressure. The shadows of their crimes seemed to stretch further with every passing day, and their mistakes began to surface. It all started with Tony. In a small Spanish town, worn down by months of fear and running, Tony broke. He turned himself into the police, offering information in exchange for a promise of a reduced sentence. It wasn't the gold that betrayed him, it was the guilt and the fear. He knew the noose was tightening around him, and he had no other choice but to cooperate. The information Tony provided to Scotland Yard set off a chain reaction. The authorities, no longer blinded by the mystery, moved with unrelenting determination. Tony's confession led to Michael's arrest, and though Michael clung to denial, the evidence against him was undeniable. Kenneth Noye, the master of laundering, was tracked down to his remote farmhouse. For weeks, the police had observed his every move, and eventually they cornered him in his own home, where he had believed himself safe. "You can't run forever," one inspector said as they took him into custody. Noye, unflinching, replied with a cold smile, "Maybe not, but at least I got away for a while." Brian was the last to be captured. After months of evading capture with fake identities and constant movement, he was finally caught in Madrid. He thought his movements had been invisible, but he hadn't accounted for the relentless detectives who had followed his trail. When they arrested him in a dark alley one evening, Brian looked at the officers without expression. But deep down, he knew this was the end of the line. "All I wanted was to be free," he murmured, as if confessing too late. But freedom has a price. The investigation began in the shadows, quiet but relentless. The detectives knew the group hadn't acted alone. Others had to be involved in laundering and selling the gold. At Scotland Yard, the interrogation rooms were cold and impersonal, designed to unnerve and isolate suspects. The sterile white lights, metal chairs, and bare walls worked to break their resolve. Brian, sitting alone in one of these rooms, stared at the table in silence. He could hear footsteps approaching, the faint murmur of voices beyond the door. The officers entered, and a heavy silence filled the room. One of them, an inspector with a piercing gaze, stood before him, a thick file under his arm. "You can keep denying it, but we know what you did," the inspector said calmly. Brian raised his tired eyes, the strain evident on his face. "Why ask me questions?" he replied. "You already know everything." As the interrogations progressed, the police pieced together the scale of the heist and the group's meticulous planning. It became clear that Tony had been the weak link in their chain. His confession had opened the door for investigators to track down the rest of the group. Testimonies aligned, evidence mounted, and the truth became undeniable. Months after the arrests, the trial of the Brinks-Matte thieves began, attracting massive media attention. Journalists crowded outside the courthouse, cameras capturing every moment of the proceedings. The defense lawyers fought to reduce the charges, but the overwhelming evidence left little room for doubt. Witnesses, former accomplices, and neighbors came forward to share what they had seen and heard. Their testimonies were often tinged with fear and resignation. When Brian stood to speak, the entire courtroom fell silent. His defense was straightforward, almost mechanical. "I never wanted it to go this way. We acted out of desperation, but the gold brought us no freedom. It destroyed everything I had. But his words fell into a void, echoes of a truth no one wanted to acknowledge. Detective Stevenson, present at every session of the trial, watched Brian with a blank expression, as if each word was another piece of a puzzle he had already solved. The prosecution's arguments were thorough and damning. The prosecutor described the thieves as an organized group who had methodically manipulated the system and eluded authorities for months. This was no impulsive act, he declared, pointing to the accused. Every move was planned, every detail meticulously prepared. They didn't just steal a fortune, they stole lives. The defense lawyers, in contrast, focused on procedural flaws and the defendant's supposed remorse. "My clients are tired men," one defense lawyer pleaded. "They were driven by temptation, but are not hardened criminals. They've lost everything they had, and that loss drove them to this." Despite the empathy in their arguments, the gravity of the crime overshadowed any mitigating factors. The verdict came down like an unavoidable sentence. Brian Robinson, Michael McAvoy, Tony White, and Kenneth Noye were all found guilty of armed robbery, money laundering, and related charges. After months of testimony and debate, the court handed down the sentences. Brian received 25 years in prison. Michael, being younger and showing better behavior during the trial, was sentenced to 20 years. Tony, who had cooperated with the police, received a reduced sentence of 15 years, though his actions would haunt him forever. Noye, with his reputation as a seasoned criminal, was sentenced to 30 years, his past weighing heavily on the court's decision. Their lives, marked forever by the stolen gold, began to rebuild behind bars. Brian, sitting alone in his cell, found solace in writing. "What I've lost can't be regained," he wrote. "The gold blinded me, but it also made me see what I didn't want to admit." In the years that followed, each of them sought to understand what had driven them to risk everything. Perhaps the gold had never truly been their target. Perhaps it had always been the freedom they sought, a freedom that came with a cost far greater than they ever imagined. And as the noise of the outside world faded, their story dissolved into the mists of time.